We are very fortunate to have a presentation on a monetary policy, which is very contemporary as the global economy emerges from the assault of the triple and multiple shocks in which, of course, we're experiencing very high interest rates across the globe, and monetary policy instruments are being invoked in a new way. But here is a paper anyway, which addresses some of the monetary policy issues. And from our very own Professor Pasquale Scaramozzino, jointly with his co-author, Professor Cesare Imbriani. So let me have the pleasure to introduce my colleague Pasquale. Pasquale is a professor of economics in the School of Finance and Management here at SOAS, University of London. And he studied from the University of Rome La Sapienza and the London School of Economics, and taught at various universities in the UK, including Bristol, University College London, and also in Italy at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata. He has contributed so many interesting, diverse areas in financial economics, monetary economics, macroeconomics, development economics, applied econometrics, are very prolific, over the years. He always very presently comes up with an interesting topic every year to involve us in the cut and thrust of his own research and shedding light some of the contemporary challenges in the global and financial sphere. So for this paper, the paper is jointly done with the Professor Cesare Imbriani, who is a professor of financial policy at Intertemporal Sapienza at the University of Rome. And he studied at the University of Napoli and also at LSE. At the time, I'm reminded to say, at the time of Harry Johnson, the great monetary economist, therefore a disciple of Harry Johnson, I would say, and taught at universities in Salerno, Bari, Napoli, Rome, and Greece. And he has also been involved in a top level policy exercises, as coordinated the Council of Experts of the Italian Ministry of the Treasury, and was also a president of San Paolo Invest, and therefore the cutting edge of practitioner engagement in investment field. Published prolifically extensively on monetary theory and policy, public finance, regulation of financial markets, labor markets, so forth. So we are fortunate to have the new duo here, a strong team of Pasquale and Cesare sharing some of the very excellent work here. And so let me also, before I invite them to start the presentation, remind colleagues to switch off a microphone so that we can minimize on the background noise, and also to try to post your comments in the chat. Let's be as constructive, suggestions, questions on this interesting work, and we shall get opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation. Of course, if you have an urge and you want to get away and get the points, please, you can use the button for showing up for show of hand, and then I will invite you to share with us your comments. So, Pasquale and Cesare, you're most welcome. Please go ahead and start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Victor, for your very kind and generous presentation. Let me share the presentation with you. The title of today's talk is Intertemporal Choices, Information and Opportunity Sets, the Effectiveness of Monetary Policy. And the main motivation for this paper is to look at recent experience in monetary policy and we have seen that it has been effective, but we have found that, or in our views, there is a gap or a discrepancy between the way monetary policy is conceived of and implemented by practitioners and by monetary authorities and the academia. And in our view, the more academic views of monetary policy are not fully consistent with the way monetary policy is practiced, and especially cannot fully account for why it is so effective. So the key question that we wanted to address, or trying to address in this paper, is what role can we find for monetary policy? And anybody who has been following the events on the world stage in the past 20 years can see that monetary policy, active monetary policy, proved extremely effective, both during the 28 financial crisis and in its aftermath, but also during the current COVID-19 pandemic. And in both occasions, monetary policy was very powerful and very instrumental in the first avoiding the deep recessions that would have occurred after each one of these crises. In the case of the financial crisis, there was a completely liquidity freeze in the banking sector, and monetary authorities were able to inject enough liquidity into the economy to avoid a domino effect among financial institutions. And also during the current COVID-19 pandemic, where arguably monetary policy acted as a surrogate for fiscal policy and to take over some responsibilities that under normal conditions would have been taken up by fiscal policy. So in both cases, monetary policy proved to be effective. And this is no surprise to practitioners, central bankers, but it's somewhat at odds with some more conventional views of monetary policy as they are held in academic circles. If we look at the academic literature on monetary policy, an influential tradition, maybe the dominant tradition in the past few decades, is that monetary policy would be largely ineffective. And the idea that the private sector would anticipate and neutralize the effects of monetary policy, so that systematic monetary policy cannot affect real variables. Implicit in all this is some sort of dichotomic view of the economy with real variables and nominal variables, with weak links between them. And according to this view, only some forms of unanticipated or surprise monetary shocks can be effective. And that can happen by effectively tricking the public, by cheating the public, by engineering some monetary surprises. And the private sector misperceive nominal shocks for real ones, and they have a real response to these purely nominal shocks. So the dominant view is that the effectiveness of monetary policy is still based on asymmetric information between the monetary authorities and the public, with the monetary authorities having some private information that is not shared by the public, and they can exploit this private information in order to engineer the monetary surprises and so that their policies could have real effects. Now, even very recent contributions follow this approach. Woodford and Angeletos and Lian, for instance, they build on the so-called rational inattention hypothesis originally put forward by Sims. And according to this view, market participants are unable to process fully all the information which is available to them. And effectively, this is equivalent to private agents being at an informational disadvantage relative to the policy authorities. So the policy authorities have an informational advantage by virtue of their greater ability to process information than the individual agents. Similarly, Nakamura and Steinson, in a paper in the QJ, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, show that monetary policy could play a signaling role by affecting the private sector's expectations about the future path of the natural rate of interest, but again, thanks to the superior information set with which the central bank is endowed. So ultimately, the effectiveness of monetary policy boils down to better information by the monetary authorities. So central banks have a better information set than the private sector. In a more empirical paper, Jaroszynski and Karady look at the announcements by the central banks and again show that they simultaneously convey information about both a monetary policy and its assessment of the economic outlook. Again, in a paper published by the Federal Bank of San Francisco, Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, Hesch and other authors argue again that the Federal Reserve possesses some insider information on the future path of interest rates, but that the ability of the private sector to interpret the monetary policy signals may be impaired during periods of instability. So effectively, monetary policy works because the monetary authorities have better information, and they can use this information to engineer some monetary surprises or to convey and find ways of conveying this information to the private sector. So it's a purely a signaling role. Now, in our view, this conventional approach, which is based on asymmetric information and signaling, risks missing what are arguably the true channels through which monetary policy can be effective. And in our view, the key for the effectiveness of monetary policy can instead be argued to be the longevity of monetary policy institutions. Monetary policy institutions have a longer time horizon than private agents by their very nature, by the way they are constituted, by their constitution, if you wish. And this asymmetry, institutional or asymmetry, if you wish, that is the ultimate reason for the effectiveness of monetary policy. And we argue that this very channel has been exploited recently. More theoretically, this longevity of the monetary policy institutions enables central banks to apply contingent forward contracts and therefore commit over a longer horizon than the private sector. Effectively, they can complete the set of markets available to the private sector. And what we shall try to argue in this paper is that this is a key channel to understand the effectiveness of monetary policy. So in our view, what really matters is not so much the different information set with which the monetary policy authorities are endowed, but rather the fact that they have a wider opportunity set than the private sector. They are more powerful than the private sector. And an illustration is a typical illustration is the famous whatever it takes speech by Mario Draghi that was delivered here in London at the UKTI's Global Investment Conference in July 2012. Effectively, by simply making that statement and bringing the full weight of the European Central Banks to the market, Draghi was able to stabilize expectations and avoid potentially devastating crisis for the euro. So it was the opportunity side, the firepower of the monetary authority, which really made the difference. So it was not so much a matter of asymmetric information or signaling. It was just the fact that the monetary authorities were so much more powerful than individual investors. So there is this asymmetric aspect in the opportunity set, but also the ability of the central banks to retain an element of unpredictability in their actions, which can be instrumental to confound speculators. And this is, again, related to their longer time horizon. They can afford to wait before implementing a policy. So if the speculators, the markets, expect that the policy variable will move in a certain direction, the central bank can decide to act in the opposite direction and take its time before implementing the policy expected by the private sector. So this way, the central bank can confound speculators and prevent speculators from taking advantage of what would effectively be almost like arbitrage profits if the expectations of investors are always fulfilled. So we want to argue that there is this institutional difference, between the central bank and the private sector, and it's this institutional aspect of central banks that is really the key to understanding why monetary policy can be so effective. And in order to have a better understanding of the issues at stake, we found it useful to go back to the older debate between Keynesians and monetarists, because we believe that everything starts there. And the original intuition by some of the leading authors of the time are still very much relevant today. Now, key contribution was Friedman's address to the American Economic Society, the famous address in 1968, when he predicted the collapse of the Phillips curve, relationship between unemployment or the level of activity and wage and price inflation. And he was able to predict the collapse of the Phillips curve, which had been exploited for policy purposes, when it was still believed to be very stable and exploitable for policy trade-offs. But in that paper, Friedman makes a more general argument. He maintains that systematic attempts to control the economy through fiscal or monetary policy, I would add, would be counterproductive and would actually exacerbate output fluctuations. And there are two key arguments for this position. First of all, the values of the estimated parameters that relate fiscal policy variables to output are unstable. They'll be very low in absolute value, and also the consumption function schedule itself would be highly unstable. So we cannot rely on fiscal policy channels because of the instability of the underlying behavior relationships. So fiscal policy would deliver erratic and unpredictable outcomes. On the other hand, a key argument, again for Friedman, a second key argument is that a decentralized market economy is inherently stable. And it would endogenously turn to revert to equilibrium in the face of exogenous shocks. And any attempts to interfere with the endogenous adjustment process of markets through the price system, demand and supply, would inevitably exacerbate rather than dampen output fluctuation. So we should let the market work unimpeded. An implication of this is that a constant and predictable rate of growth of money supply can be effective in anchoring the expectations of the private sector and allow for a speedy return of prices and output to their market clearing equilibrium values. And again, simple rules be preferable to discretion, because the latter would interfere with the mechanism of the price system, with the stabilizing mechanism of the price system, and would destabilize the economy. Well, a follow-up to Friedman's analysis is Gillan and Prescott study of rules versus discretion in economic policy. And they purported to show that in a dynamic setting with endogenous expectations, a time consistency policy will not coincide with the first best optimal policy. So again, it's an argument in favor of rules rather than discretion. Discretionary policies would not be inconsistent, so there would be an incentive to deviate from the first best optimal policy when as time elapses. So discretionary policies will not be credible effectively. Now, there was a strong Keynesian response at the time. Tobin was particularly vocal and effective under this respect. The 1970 paper that was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, title is Post Hoc Ergo Propter Hoc. It's a famous article with a Latin title. He looks at the dynamics with monetary and output growth in the US, and it shows that Friedman had made the argument that monetary growth anticipates and predicts output growth. Tobin shows that it could actually be the other way around, that it's output growth in the business cycle that anticipates and predicts monetary aggregates. So it's unclear the direction of causality. In his own address to the American Economic Review, 1972, in the American Economic Review, Tobin is even more radical in his criticism and questions the inherent stability of a market economy. It goes back to the old Keynesian argument of whether nominal wage adjustments can be effective to stabilize the labor market. And he argues that there are deep big questions about the effectiveness of nominal wage adjustment. And he argues that inflation and deflation have very asymmetric consequences, and in particular, the possibly damaging effects of deflation would offer justification for active policies. Tobin's analysis is related to the debt deflation spiral, first studied by Irving Fisher in the 1930s, and that deflation vicious circle. Modigliani also intervened quite forcefully, again in the American Economic Review, paper titled "The Monetary Controversy, or Should We Forsake Stabilization Policies?" And I simply argued that it would be difficult to attribute the fluctuations of output in market economies since World War II to an erratic growth of money supply or to unintended consequences of stabilization policies. But the fundamental objection by Modigliani is that monetary policy alone would be insufficient to correct imbalances from exogenous shocks. And so the shocks have an unequal impact on the different sectors of the economy. So there could be some allocation implications of shocks. And economic policy must also play an allocative function in the face of an inadequate effort by the private sector and possibly failure of the private system. But ultimately, the difference, the distinction between between Friedman and the Keynesians like Tobin, Modigliani, was on a different view of the economy, a different view of the capitalist decentralized market economy. According to Friedman, the market economy is inherently stable. According to Modigliani, Tobin, it is not. And the market economy may be unable to rapidly absorb the effects of exogenous shocks, and price systems and the automatic stabilizer through tax and government spending channels will not be enough to restore equilibrium. We would need a discretionary counter-cyclical policy. Now, briefly, the new classical macroeconomics that followed from Friedman. Some of the prominent contributors, authors are Lucas, Sargent, Barrow. They introduced rational expectations hypotheses in macro models. And the main contention is that conventional Keynesian policies have no rigorous underpinnings. They are not consistent with rational behavior by economic agents. Optimizing agents would anticipate systematic policies, and so systematic policy would be ineffective and obtain strong neutrality propositions. Again, rational forward-looking agents would anticipate and neutralize the effects of systematic counter-cyclical monetary policy. Now, possible exceptions to this would be the presence of nominal rigidities in prices and wages, which prevent the price system from working fully and timely. And so they could introduce delays in the adjustment of real variables to nominal shocks, or again, asymmetric information between the policy authorities and the public, with an informational advantage being, being enjoyed by the monetary authorities. And this is a view which is expounded in very numerous academic contributions and in the textbooks by Blanchard and Fisher, the very influential lectures on macroeconomics, and by the more recent textbook by Jordi Galli on, again, on macroeconomics and monetary economics. Now, a critique of the gradual expectations variety of monetaries was also presented by Tobin in a very beautiful book published in 1980. It's called Asset Accumulation and Economic Activity. And quite early on, Tobin showed that he was aware of some dead ends that macroeconomic research and monetary economics was taking at the time. And he was able to foresee some of the difficulties that would have emerged later. But still, the academia followed that path. Now, Aubin argues that rational expectations could be seen as a convenient attempt to approximate an arrow de bleu economy with fully contingent markets in a second best world. So if there are no full set of contingent markets as in the arrow de bleu, the rational expectations approach could be seen as a way of approximating that ideal outcome. The main appeal of the assumption is that it recognizes that agents learn from past experience and make full use of all the information that are available to them. And so the expectations are consistent with the model of the economy. That indeed, a better way to characterize rational expectations would be model consistent expectations. This is the way they're used in meant in macroeconomics. But outside of steady state equilibrium, it's not clear how to define consistency of expectations. And this is a key issue really in macroeconomic modeling. And also, now the rational expectations approach tries to identify the value of a payoff to the agent in terms of utility or profits with its mathematical expectations. But if agents are risk averse and operate in a stochastic environment, we know that the mathematical expectation does not coincide with certainty equivalent value of a payoff. And this was shown again by Tobin in his paper on liquidity preferences, behavior towards risk in 1958. So the rational expectations approach is not fully consistent actually with rational behavior under uncertainty, because rational agents under risk aversion consider not just the first moment of the distribution, the mathematical expectation, but also the second moment, the variance and higher moments related to the asymmetry of the distribution. And therefore, this is a strong criticism to the question, to this approach. Now there is still there's still a debate on what are the reasons for the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy. Not say much about fiscal policy today, but again, there have been a big debate which has centered on the magnitude of the fiscal multipliers. And Blanchard and Lee, in this article in the American Economic Review and in other contributors, show that the fiscal multipliers can actually be much larger than what had been originally, or what had been believed for a long time. So there is possibly more role for fiscal policy than had been believed. And concerning monetary policy, in recent decades, we have seen the application of quantitative easing of unconventional programs, and these are bound to have allocative consequences in addition to usual stabilization effects, which still we have seen can be quite powerful. The purchase of securities issued by private corporations by central banks as unconventional monetary programs affects relative asset prices and therefore introduces asymmetries across different sectors of the economy. So there's clearly an allocative impact. And also, something we're mentioning with Victor just before the seminar, there are concerns about the size of the monetary stimulus in advanced economies and the resurgence of inflationary pressures. Summers issued an early warning on this, and we have seen that his fears have actually materialized with much higher rates of inflation in most Western countries and in many emerging markets too, and which are experiencing high and quite persistent rise of inflation. So all the previous analysis is based on effectively monetary policy being able to have an effect on the real economy because of some asymmetric information, because of some lags in the way expectations by the private sector adjust to new information, and or because of a signaling role of monetary policy. But we believe that there is another important, maybe the main channel through which monetary policy can be effective, and this is the longevity of its institutions and its exclusive power to issue fiat money. And even in the presence of rational expectations, perfectly flexible prices, continuous market clearing, and thematic information between the authorities and the private sector, systematic demand management policies can still be effective stabilization tools. Even more than that, monetary policy can be effective even if the monetary authorities, the central bank, are at an informational disadvantage relative to the private sector. So even if it's a private sector which has an informational advantage over the monetary authorities, monetary policy can still be effective. So in effect, this approach turns the original analysis or the conventional analysis upside down. And the key, as already mentioned, is a broad opportunity set with which the monetary authorities are endowed. They are able to commit themselves over a longer time horizon than private individuals. And it is this asymmetry in the effective planning horizon that is crucial for the effectiveness of monetary policy and fiscal policy, actually. Actually, if we look at what are central banks can really be defined in terms of their unlimited time horizon and their ability to issue fiat means of payments, fiduciary means of payment. This is what defines central banks. And it's a little bit of a paradox that these institutional aspects that define central banks have been somewhat overlooked in the literature that tries to explain a monetary policy and try to explain why they are effective. So it could be argued that the effectiveness of monetary policy has been studied using what possibly is a misleading model of a monetary economy model which is based on asymmetric information, but symmetry in terms of the opportunity set. And when we looked at the literature, we realized that this point had already been made a long time ago by a colleague and friend of ours, Giancarlo Marini, in a number of original powerful contributions. Giancarlo Marini, I should say, was a close friend both of Cesare and me. He passed away, sadly, about 10 years ago, prematurely. But he had a big role, certainly in my own development as economist and macroeconomist. He taught me macroeconomics at the LSE, where he had studied and where then he worked as a lecturer. Giancarlo had started his PhD under Janet Yellen at the LSE. And then once Yellen moved to Berkeley with her husband, George Lakerlof, he went to complete his PhD with Willem Bouter. And then he worked at the LSE as a lecturer for a number of years before returning to Italy. And he, in the height of the new classical macroeconomics revolution, he shows some conceptual inconsistency in their approach. And particularly, he demonstrated that even under the most extreme assumptions that they would make perfectly flexible prices, rational expectations, aggregate demand management policy can be restored when agents are forward-looking and they implement some form of intertemporal substitution and face a signal extraction problem. So when they look at the information which they have available in order to guess, make best predictions of economy-wide variables. So these are the very assumptions made by neoclassical macroeconomists. And Giancarlo Marini showed that even under these assumptions, it is possible to show that monetary policy can be effective. And so the crucial distinction is between information sets and opportunity sets. In our view, this is a key for understanding the effectiveness of monetary policy, even in light of the more recent experience. And in particular, the monetary authorities can succeed in stabilizing the economy, even if they were to be at an informational disadvantage relative to the private sector. And we show how Giancarlo Marini was able to prove this result in some of his contributions, but we believe that his approach is more general than that. And indeed, Willem Bouter, a few years after Giancarlo published his papers, wrote that, read Bouter's quote, on reading recent contributions to this literature, the conclusion is inescapable that Marini's powerful and general result about policy effectiveness in neoclassical macro models has not yet permeated a large part of the professional economic awareness. So what I like to do is to try and explain how we can show that monetary policy can be effective thanks to this asymmetry in the opportunity sites. Now, there were some earlier contributions by Tarnowski and Weiss, but the framework chosen by Giancarlo Marini is more general than that, so I'll try and explain that. So the even without any asymmetry of information, the expected future rate of inflation could depend upon the current expectations of future conditional policy responses. So the very fact that the private agent knows that the central banks can intervene is that is able to stabilize expectations. And so the central bank can commit over a longer planning horizon, and it could be effective in the short term to stabilize the cycle, but it also has an effect in the long term on capital accumulation and on the long run level of consumption. And this can be shown within overlapping generations models with positive birth and death rates. And the government can commit itself to policies which involve transfers to future and as yet unborn generations. So this result is related to the Ricardian equivalence. And we know kind of equivalence maintains that given a fiscal spending program, the timing of taxes is irrelevant because if agents expect an increase in future taxes, they will start saving now and thereby offsetting the tax policies by the government. But in an overlapping generation context, this may not be the case, and these have been shown by Blanchard and Bauter. And then the key for the non-neutrality of fiscal policy is a positive birth rate. So if there is the expectation of future generations which are as yet unborn, and imperfect intergenerational altruism, the government and the current generations can transfer some of the burden to the as yet unborn generations. For new generation of positive birth rate, we can read positive immigration. So new generations could be children who are not yet born, or immigrants who come from abroad, and they are not perfectly linked by an altruistic mechanism to the current generation. And so the private sector might have a tendency to underinvest, and this could be offset by monetary policy. So first, before I continue, could I ask if there are any questions at this stage?
Well, Pasquale, no, at this stage. So I think we'll wait and pick some question at the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. So the way this result can be proved analytically can be using a very classical model put forward by Barrow in the Journal of Monetary Economics. This is one of the most influential papers in the literature New Classical Macroeconomics, which is an island type model. It takes a lead from the Lucas's originally island models. And agents are assumed to specializing in acquiring information in their own local environment, but their knowledge of economy-wide variables is less accurate, and therefore they have to make inferences about economy-wide variables from the variables that they observe locally. So this is a signal extraction problem that they face. They can see the price in their local environment or the variables in the local environment, and they try to extract signals from the variables that they observed about the economy-wide variables. And this asymmetric information is captured by assuming that the realizations of local variables are observed at the exact time that they occur, whereas macroeconomic variables are only observed after a time lag. They inhabit isolated islands, so they only observe the local price, but make optimal inferences about the current economy-wide variables by solving a signal extraction problem conditional on their information set. So they make best possible use of all the information they have to guide their decisions. But this differential information between local and aggregate variables could be responsible for a potential misperception of nominal changes in prices for real ones. They can misread the current macroeconomic variables, and so they could alter their real demand or supply in response to purely nominal shocks. Now the model, I'll go very quickly through the model. It's actually very standard. We assume that each island or market produces a new non-durable commodity, and this commodity is denoted and indexed by Z. the supply and demand for each commodity depend both on the current price of output in the market Z relative to the price which is expected to prevail next period, and on expected wealth, and on systematic factors which are ignored for simplicity. So this would be the supply of output Z at time t. S stands for supply. Depends on two elements. The first component is the intertemporal substitution element, which has a positive effect on the supply of output. Is multiplied by parameter alpha S. The second component, this will be the wealth effect, and this is a negative effect on the supply of output. The symbols are conventional. M is money supply, delta M is money growth, P is price, and epsilon T is supply side shocks, and all the variables are in logs. So the first element is the intertemporal substitution, leisure and labor supply. If the current price is higher than the price that is expected to prevail next year, then agents will increase labor supply, and the negative wealth effect has a the real wealth effect has a negative effect through increased demand for leisure. And it is assumed, as in Barrow, that the substitution effect dominates the wealth effect. Now, omega T of Z is the information set in market Z at time t. And this includes all the past history of the economy, the current price prevailing in the market, so PTZ, and the model itself. So we write the information set at time t in market Z is equal to the past full information set, omega t minus 1 is the full history of the economy up to and including time t minus 1, plus the current local price. The demand for output has a similar structure, same determinants, but with opposite signs. And now the substitution effect is negative because of price speculation by the demanders, and the wealth effect is positive on demand. And again, the substitution effect is assumed to dominate the wealth effect. Okay, so these are standard assumptions. They're both demand and supply shocks, epsilon S and epsilon T. A market clear condition, market Z, is that supply is equal to demand. And we can simplify the model or simplify the notation, assume alpha is the sum of all the intertemporal substitution parameters, beta is the sum of all the wealth effects parameters, epsilon T is the difference between the shocks, so the demand shocks minus the supply shocks, which is assumed to have a normal distribution with constant variance. Now, the stochastic structure of the economy is completed by an aggregate random shock. So there's both local shocks, the epsilon, and an aggregate random shock, U. And you could also be thought of as a difference between a demand and supply disturbance. We can define aggregate price index and aggregate outputs as geometric averages across all markets of the prices and outputs. And let's remember that all variables are in logarithms. And so the appropriate average is a geometric one. And the idiosyncratic shocks across all markets add up to 0 by construction. And the economy-wide shock is assumed to follow a random walk with white noise shocks, VT, which are orthogonal to the idiosyncratic shocks, so that the macro shocks are orthogonal to the local idiosyncratic shocks. Okay. Money growth, now this is important, then this can be described in terms of a stochastic control rule, which includes both a systematic and a random component. Now, MT is the random component, the unanticipated, unpredictable component of money supply, where the second element, FT prime times psi T of L, this is an inner product of policy parameters times lagged economy-wide variables. So this would be the standard monetary policy reaction function. But MT is the unanticipated random component of monetary policy, okay, which in principle could be used by the monetary authorities to fool the private sector and engineer purely nominal shocks. So we can express all the components of the model in a compact form by defining vector, which includes all the shocks, local idiosyncratic shocks, epsilon t, the macro aggregate shocks, Vt, and the monetary shocks, Mt. Okay? It's uncorrelated, so the variance covariance matrix is diagonal. Now the solution will yield a set of values for prices and for output. So for all the local prices, Pt of Z, for the aggregate price level, Pt, and for output. And now this solution, which is obtained when agents solve their signal extraction problem under asymmetric information, will in general be different from the full information solution, the solution which will be obtained under full information set. Now, what is the role for monetary policy in this context? Well, Barrow assumes a particular monetary feedback rule. Monetary growth is given by the monetary shock, monetary surprise, MT, plus a counter-cyclical function, counter-cyclical reaction to last period's price level. And he shows that this rule is ineffective, in the sense that it's not able to move output away from its full information equilibrium. And this statement, this assertion by Barrow, is correct. So Barrow does show that this model, given this reaction function, monetary policy function, monetary policy is ineffective. However, the rule postulated by Barrow is the only one for which policy ineffectiveness holds. And the reason is a technical one, because money is characterized as a store of value for period t+1, and only monetary growth estimates from period 2+2 onwards matter. Barrow examines the effectiveness of monetary policy using, again, this monetary reaction function. But the peculiar thing is that this is the only model for which this is true. And for a more general feedback rule, we can have, again, policy effectiveness. And to this purpose, Giancarlo Merini considers a general class of purely conditional money growth rules, where the feedback involves not just the last value of the aggregate shock, but includes a number of potential past values of both the monetary shocks and the aggregate shock. And this is a richer monetary growth rule. It's a richer monetary feedback rule because it allows for a richer set of responses to the lagged variables. Again, private agents cannot observe the current aggregate variables. They have to solve a signal extraction problem. And the information set is defined as before, all the past history of the system plus the current local idiosyncratic shock. And the signal extraction solution of the model should be compared with the benchmark full information solution, which is such that the information is the decisions of the agents are conditional on the full information set that includes both the local information set and also the current contemporaneous variables. So this is whether the in the presence of asymmetric information, imperfect information, monetary policy can restore the equilibrium to its full information level. So we have to compare and contrast the intertemporal substitution term under imperfect information. This is the expression that we have seen before, where the expected value of the future price level is conditional on the local information set, with the full information intertemporal substitution term, where the expectation of the future price level is conditional on the full information set, which also comprises the current current shocks. And well, can be shown that the difference between the actual and the full information set is given by this expression. Okay, and then solve the model, which requires a fair amount of algebra. But if we solve the model, the difference between actual and full information set can be expressed in terms of this sum. Okay? This sum it has the monetary shock, the unanticipated component of the monetary shock, the unanticipated component of the aggregate shock. So these are the two surprise elements. The monetary surprise, MT minus its expectation, and the real macroeconomic surprise, VT minus its expected value. So in the context of this framework, a perfect stabilization is obtained when the signal extraction solution is made to coincide with the full information solution. But in this term, in this form, we can see that the solution is actually quite trivial because it's sufficient to choose parameters. The policy parameters are gamma and delta. Choose policy parameters such that the expressions in square brackets are equal to 0. So if the expressions in square brackets are equal to 0, there is no longer a difference between asymmetric information solution and full information solution. So monetary policy can be very effective, can perfectly stabilize the outcome, the macroeconomic equilibrium, to its full information value. And we can see that there is an infinite number of parameters for which this is true. And so it's sufficient to set the policy parameters gamma and delta, which appear in the monetary policy function, such that these parameters are equal to 0, to have a perfect stabilization of output. And well, this is a very trivial solution, which effectively says that the central bank only responds to shocks, aggregate shocks that took place exactly 1 year before. So ignores everything else, ignores all the previous shocks or the shocks further back into the past, only responds to the shocks that take place exactly 1 year before. And by simply doing that, the monetary authorities can always perfectly stabilize output around this full information level. So even if the central bank has no knowledge of the aggregate shocks, the private sector may know them, but the central bank need not know the aggregate shocks, provided the central banks can commit itself to responding to some lagged shocks. This by itself is sufficient to fully stabilize output. And this is a very powerful result, because here we could have that the monetary authorities is at a deep informational disadvantage relative to the private sector, but this is completely irrelevant. What matters is that the central bank can commit itself to responding in the future to something that happened today. And this is the key for the effectiveness of monetary policy. So the monetary authorities may only be allowed to use one or let's say two pieces of information, like the 365 years in the past, but could be the same no matter how far we go into the past. So the ability, what matters for policy effectiveness is not superior information, but rather the ability to commit over a longer time horizon. And Barrow's monetary policy constitutes a singular case. It's the inability to stabilize output, because his feedback parameter is actually the only one that does not affect the difference between actual and full information substitution term. So Barrow was able to find the only case of monetary ineffectiveness. Now, from an economic point of view, apart from the algebra and the specifics of the model, what really drives the result is the fact that the policy authorities can act by implementing a contingent forward contract. So it can respond to past information to commit to an action in the future. And this can complete the set of contracts available in the model. And under rational expectations, this very fact changes the informational content of the current local price and makes it fully revealing. So what really matters is not the fact that the central bank has superior information, but simply the fact that it can commit itself to taking some action which depends on something that happened in the past. So we know that the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England can respond to current events, and it is a fact that can help stabilize markets. It's also important to notice that in this framework, stabilization and allocative effects of monetary policy cannot be separated. And well, don't show it today in the seminar, but it is in the original papers. And Giancarlo Marini shows that the equilibrium value of real output under both incomplete information and full information depend on both the first and the second moments. But the first and second moments of them depends on the policy feedback parameter. And therefore, it's impossible to implement a policy aimed at stabilizing the economy without also having some allocative consequences. So the stabilization and allocative consequences and effects of monetary policy are inextricably intertwined. So we cannot have a purely allocative policy, purely stabilization policy without any allocative implications. Okay. So what conclusions can we draw from the analysis? Well, we started by considering the effectiveness of monetary policies in terms of stabilization and the debate on rules versus discretion. And the argument, the analysis presented today shows that discretionary rules, discretion in the implementation of a monetary policy can be superior to simple rules. And Tobin put it quite forcefully. This is from a chapter in a book. A mechanical rule blind to actual economic events and outcomes could not work, and for that reason alone would not be tolerated by central bankers, governments, and electorates. So it's important that central banks retain the discretion to respond to unanticipated shocks in a way that involves them using their discretion effectively. If they are forced and their hands tied too strictly, that could actually undermine their credibility. Because the public would realize that tight rules could not be followed forever. And so monetary authorities have an advantage over the private sector, but this advantage is related to the longevity of their institution and to their power to issue fiat money. With incomplete private markets, we are not in an arrow-the-Bray economy with a fully complete set of contingent markets. The government has a richer opportunity set than the private sector. The presence of asymmetric information, monetary policy can play a signaling role, but the signaling role can go through their ability to implement contingent contract. So they can commit themselves to responding in the future to events that happen today. And so monetary policy can be effective even under textbook conditions under which we study that it cannot be effective, rational expectations, perfectly flexible prices, and continuous market clearing. So even if we take this extreme polar case, we think monetary policy ineffective, well, this is not the case. In an intertemporal setting, the government can also enact transfers across generations, thereby influencing the allocation of resources and enhancing capital accumulation. And the condition for this is that there is a positive birth rate in the economy. New generations will appear in the future, or there'll be new people coming into the country from abroad can be assimilated to that, and they can reallocate resources across generations. Now, Western countries, as we have seen, have turned to activist monetary policy to mitigate and counter the consequences of the financial crisis, which started in 2008, and also the current COVID-19 pandemic. And the analysis in this paper, in a sense, vindicates these efforts, and in a way shows why they can be effective, quite irrespective of the ability of central banks to have superior information. In our view, that's very much a second-order effect. We are in a second-best world with missing markets, and monetary policy can be effective, both for stabilizing the economy in the face of shocks and for sustaining capital accumulation. And this is what we are seeing with the accommodating policies deployed by the Federal Reserve and by the European Central Bank, by Bank of England. It's also interesting to see the new monetary policy strategy review, which was announced by the European Central Bank in July 2021. This corrects the previous policy strategy, which had been communicated, I think, in the early 2000s, I think in 2003. Now, the objective of price stability must be achieved by aiming for a symmetric 2% inflation target over the medium term, in contrast to the previous policy strategy, yes, I last agreed in 2003, which requires the inflation rate to be close to but under 2%. So now it's symmetrical. Of course, now the whole debate with the increasing inflation, whether even this 2% inflation target is appropriate, and what can be done, and that raises the issue of what are the underlying causes of inflation. Certainly, the monetary expansion of the past few years played a role, but there are also some specific factors. Energy prices in Europe, the large fiscal expansion in the United States, and for the UK, I would maintain that Brexit was also a factor for higher inflation. But as it happened, the asymmetric framework built into the previous targets of the ECB result effectively in a deflationary bias in the monetary policy, where the new target would be more symmetrical. Again, in addition to the stabilization objective of the monetary authorities, even conventional monetary policies could have allocative effects. But in the non-conventional monetary policies that have been implemented in recent years, the deployment of unconventional monetary tools has even stronger allocative effects. form of negative interest rates, long-term refinancing operations, and especially direct purchase of stocks and debt securities, other than government bonds. They have a clear allocative impact. And a number of central banks have resorted to these methods, and therefore the stabilization and allocative aspects of their policies cannot be fully separated. And this is particularly obvious in the case of climate change considerations that have been explicitly introduced in these monetary policy operations by the European Central Bank. And certainly in this country, in the UK, in the Bank of England, the former governor, Mark Carney, had first raised the issue of the importance of climate change consideration, even just from the point of view of the stability of the financial and banking system. And both this measure, the monetary authorities will pursue allocative objectives, which are regarded as socially desirable in the presence of market failures. There are environmental externalities associated with our exploitation of natural resources, which are not fully internalized in a decentralized market economy. And thanks to the longevity of the central bank, and especially its capacity to internalize the welfare of future generations, the monetary authorities can help achieve not just stabilization of output, as we've seen, but also hopefully a more equitable allocative outcome, a more equitable use of resources, both now and intertemporally for future generations. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me say a reaction of a hand of applause. Thank you so much, Pasquale, and your colleague Cesare for such a brilliant paper. I enjoyed the presentation all the way. First of all, setting out the general problem that you are looking at, the power of monetary policy backed by institutional characteristics, and then doing an effective job basically of reviewing the literature, including the very early literature in this discussion, and building up to the current conditions, setting out a plausible mathematical model that ties all these arguments together. And then finally, after deriving the conclusions from that theoretical model, update the information with the current contemporary issues. Absolutely smashing. Thank you indeed, Pasquale. And in many ways, you're also motivating researchers, policymakers, ourselves to think deeply about how to deal with monetary policy in the context of the multiple shocks in the global economy today. And I guess that researchers, including myself, we will be thinking about how to build on these models, which, Pasquale and Cesare, you have introduced. And indeed, there was a statement that you quoted that monetary policy have the advantage over the private sector because of the longevity of the institution, that's the crux of the paper, and the exclusive power to issue fiat money. Now, one could look at this paper possible extension and look at the fact that already Bank of England, European Central Bank, Bank of Singapore, and others are already experimenting with what is called a central bank digital currency, the E-value that will go, kind of fiat version, okay, which will have its own properties and possibly in terms of also multiplier effects. So that could be a way of saying the exclusive power of fiat money in view of developments in cryptocurrencies may be a little bit compromised in the next 5 years. Okay, but the model is also tractable, and I was very pleased to hear you in the last couple of, I think the last 2 slides, mentioning about coping with the challenges from climate change, incorporating climate change into the perspectives of monetary policy That's indeed brilliant. And, central bankers are interested in this. And I wish our colleague Uli Vors from the economics department was here, because he and colleagues are keen in introducing climate risk into central bank as monetary policy reaction functions. But also, it was not so much of asset prices, but I guess asset prices were so informed. So this way of thinking another version of your paper, motivated by the good research that you've done, and also in other extension, the model is very robust, very plausible. It solves in P and Q. It solves in the prices and solves in quantities. Okay, which are the main kind of targets. And as you said, you are kind of dismantling of the Phillips curve. It is possible that one could think of extending this paper in terms of not only prices, quantities, but also the exchange rate. Because since 1971, the particular exchange rate and foreign reserves has changed to the extent that current models try to look at monetary policy implications, not for, not only prices, and not only for output, but also for the development evolution of the exchange rate. And that possibly is, one other extension of this model. But the analysis is all very well structured in the kind of looking at monetary policy and also throwing in fiscal policy. And indeed, in the last slide, you did acknowledge that fiscal policy will have a role, but your institution, your main thrust is to give of the institutions. Thanks very much. Absolutely smashing. Now, I'd like to open the discussion to the floor, and maybe I don't know whether Cesare you want to come in now, or you should come in when we are getting comments from the floor. I don't want to deny you the opportunity to weigh in if you want to. Cesare? Hello? Pasquale?
Yes, no, Cesare might have like.
Okay. Oh, well, we're going with the discussion. Of course, he will be free to come in at any time he wants. Okay. Or did you want him to make an interjection now or later? Pasquale? Is that okay with you?
Yes, no, I don't know if Cesare would like to intervene now.
Or maybe in the course of the discussion when we get a question.
Yes,
Okay.
No,
okay.
but
Okay.
yes, but
So,
yes, I'm happy to. Well, thank you for your brief summary and for your nice words about the paper and for suggestions for extension. I think they're very interesting. Maybe we can discuss them.
Yeah, thank you. That will be a joint Murinde Scaramozzino paper. Okay. Or the other way around. Okay. We have three hands up, and I'll take them in the order they came. First, Yana, then Christine, and then Bob. So, Yana, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much for the lovely presentation, and I really enjoyed, and especially part that is sorry about that. Especially intertemporal the concept, bringing the intertemporal concept on the discussions in all papers. My question is also your maybe link with or comments is from the let's take the Draghi's phrase, whatever it takes. In this concept, can we say that is the monetary policy can be used or has been used to redistribution of the wealth in the society?
Thank you.
Yes,
question.
should I respond
ahead.
now or shall I?
No, please respond now, so we have a kind of a discussion.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for your comment. Yes, I think the intertemporal choice, intertemporal substitution aspect is essential to really any dynamic analysis. So it's important to recognize that all the decisions we make have an intertemporal element. It could be explicit or implicit, and but particularly relevant in macroeconomic decisions that involve allocation of resources over time. Now the Draghi, whatever it takes, speech, and then the aggressive monetary policy pursued by the European Central Bank under his tenure. Yes, I think it had redistributional consequences, where one obvious one was a redistribution across member states of the Eurozone. I don't know whether this is what you were referring in particular. And,
no, it's
also,
particularly within the society. I mean, within
yes.
the country, that is we are talking about is the different groups and different structures
Yes.
within the society. Then is it really acceptable to monetary authority use to a monetary policy as a redistribution of the wealth within the society? This is the more ethical or more philosophical question that I am asking. The monetary authority has no power or no being elected institutions, where then when we see is a not be elected institution, not be choice, but significantly use the monetary policy redistribution of the wealth within a border.
Yes, I think it's a very important question that certainly is certainly true. I mean, the expansionary monetary policy pursued by the European Central Bank and by other central banks certainly had important redistributional effects away from lenders and in favor of borrowers. So it had a redistribution within the society and among different groups of agents in the society. And I think this also goes back, and it's certainly true that the European Central Bank, or in general, the monetary authority, for the way they have designed, they tend to be entrusted with stabilization role, not with an allocative role. They don't have the political mandate to do that, and that's certainly true. I think this goes back to the debate on the independence of the central bank, on whether it is acceptable to have an independent monetary authority that is not directly under the subject of the government. The government has a popular mandate in democratic societies, and government is elected on the basis of a program. The central bank is not, it's managed by bureaucrats. So how do we manage the relationship between the democratically elected government and the authority of the central bank, which is unelected? And we know that independence of the central bank is crucial for the credibility of central bank policies. And so I think most of the literature would agree that if the central bank is directly under the control of the treasury or under the control of the government, this could undermine its credibility in the face of anti-inflationary policies. I think one possible compromise is for the government to set the broad targets to which the monetary authorities must adhere in terms, for instance, of constant and stable rate of inflation, stability of the financial sector, and then leave operational discretion to the central bank. So the government sets the targets, and then the central bank is free to pursue those targets, which are set by a democratically elected government in the way that it believes is most appropriate. And in this context, the ultimate mandate of the European Central Bank was to defend the euro. So the central bank had to make sure that the euro would not collapse. I think that was the ultimate the ultimate objective of the European Central Bank, maintain the stability and credibility of the euro. And given the exceptional circumstances at the time, there was actually and the tensions within the euro area, there was a not negligible risk of collapse of the currency. So as I see it, that was not the whatever it takes policy was an extreme policy, but possibly the only one which was feasible under the circumstances, and the only one which could save the euro. But yes, I agree with your point about that, the fact that it's well, it's difficult to disentangle a stabilization from an allocative role for the central bank. And indeed, the model that presented in the seminar shows that even conceptually, it's not possible to disentangle them. You cannot have purely stabilization policies without allocative without allocative consequences.
Thank you, Pascal.
Thank you, but I will discuss a bit more in there, but let me give the time the others to ask, and if there is any time, I can.
Thank you indeed, Yana, for those political economy considerations, and thanks, Pasquale, for the response. Indeed, these are points that can have long discussion, or maybe we shall come back to them as we go. Christine.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. And yeah, I fully agree with Yena's comments. Pasquale, I really enjoyed the paper and your presentation. And as you might guess, I'm going to ask something about the real economy, since you know that monetary policy is always my weakness. And it's not dissimilar, I think, to Yena's question, which is, how can you fit into this? And you have indicated places where you could fit it in. The question of what government, if there's a government investment policy, for example, linked to this monetary policy, so the link between fiscal monetary policy, what difference does it make what that money is spent on? I mean, if we just have an expansionary monetary policy, and the hope is, I guess, that businesses will invest, how is that different? Because the problem was that they were slow to invest. A lot of money was injected into the economy, but it didn't have very high multiplier effects on the real side of the economy. And there is a sort of view linked in with climate change, which you touched on at the end, that if you use government investment to invest in infrastructure to help deal with climate change, the multiplier effects are large, and therefore the policy ends up paying for itself without inflationary consequences. I realise that's a little bit outside your main area, but I just wondered if you had any wisdom, any insight into that.
Thank you, Christine. Pasquale, I think we're still muted. Yeah.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Christine. Yes, no, agree. Monetary policy does have real consequences, and it's very important to look not just at the size of the intervention in the monetary market or open market operations, on the size of the non-conventional monetary policy instruments that have been put in place, but also look at how and what exactly which assets are involved, and what are the impact are on the real economy. Yes, I don't have much to say about these aspects of how the monetary policy was implemented in the euro area, or in the UK, or in the US. But the general point, yes, it's certainly true that the exact instruments that are used by the monetary authorities and the sectors in which they decide to intervene would be of great import in terms of real consequences for the economy. So the fact that the central bank intervene also directly in the asset purchase strategies in favor of assets that are involved with more environmentally friendly activities would have an impact, and certainly implications on the allocation of resources across sectors. And I mean, if you wish, this also goes back to the original analysis by Modigliani, who is concerned about the fact that, well, in case shocks have asymmetric effects across sectors of the economy, and we need some stabilization policies to correct for the imbalances that shocks create. And central banks could have a more direct involvement in that. But I suppose that also goes back to the question that Diana was posing about whether it is acceptable for what should be an independent institution without an explicit political mandate to carry out an allocative redistribution. And so it's an important question, but I think there's a huge debate about that. And
okay. Thanks, Christian, for the question, and thanks, Pasquale, for the answer and giving us a lot more insight. So we now move to Bo. Bo, welcome, Bo. Bo is another monetary policy expert, and therefore, yes, has been following the paper with great interest. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for a very good presentation, and the historical expose is very interesting and very good. For the last 20, 30 years, the expectations has really been at the center of monetary policy. Then if we look at what has happened after the financial crisis with the interest rate, is that the forward interest rates have always been pointing upward. And it seems that the market has constantly over-predicted the future interest rates, and perhaps also over-predicted coming inflation. My question is, why is that so? Possibly models explain it. What have you observed?
Sorry, the connection was not very good. The audio was not very good. I was not able to hear well the second part of your question, the final part of your question.
So the question is that we can observe that forward interest rates has been over-predicting the actual interest rates for the last 10 years up until the pandemic, systematically. And they will also over-predicting inflation. When we look at the future interest rate that we can observe from yield curves, etc. And my question is, why is that so? And could it possibly model?
Yes, my answer is that I don't know. I think that possibly in this case the market was expecting a return to more normal conditions. Maybe in that way the market was more backward-looking in the way it formed its expectations and didn't realize that there was somewhat of a changing regime during that period. This changing regime may have been transitory. As I said, now we can see a sudden increase again in the rate of inflation, and I think also in the gap between forward interest rates and actual interest rates and spot interest rates, I think is narrowing now. But yes, maybe the market don't fully internalize the relatively different regime that was in place at the time. And so, yes, I remember also porcupine graph which looks at expectations of inflation that was always going up, but then actual inflation was quite stable. So if you look at the graph, it looks like a porcupine of expected inflation with the spikes going up, and actual inflation was still modest. I mean, a number of reasons have been put forward as to why inflation was so unexceptionally low during that period. Globalization, increased supply from China. I don't know what is the exact reason, but I think, yes, that was a puzzle. Thank you. Maybe you have an explanation for that.
Maybe do you, Bo, maybe expectations are not entirely rational, they may be adaptive.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Bo and Pasquale. Oladapo is an active student of central banking with both monetary policy and regulation. He's the member of Center for Global Finance now in his final year of his PhD program. Oladapo.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was quite insightful, and I think it's actually very important that we remind ourselves, the role of central banks, in modern economy. And in the abstract, you mentioned the fact that their power, in a way, has been overlooked, which I tend to agree. Because if you look at what Goodhart concluded in his paper, Evolution of Central Banking, he made a statement saying that it is the non-competitive ability of central banks that makes them to perform the role which they are actually meant to perform. And if you look at in the structure, in the market structure where you have a monopolist structure, you obviously have information asymmetry. So I think that speaks to the conclusion in your paper, saying, even with information asymmetry, you can still have, effective monetary policy. And I think we can draw that from Goodhart's conclusion, as way back as 1988, which I think, it's been overlooked in the literature. So my question is, what can we draw from these conclusions and infuse it into the free banking model, where we have a decentralized monetary system? Because in a decentralized monetary system, the assumption is that you have no information asymmetry from the market participants and the issuer. And it speaks to what Professor Victor mentioned earlier on about cryptocurrencies. So if you look at the crypto markets, and you look at the framework of which is built on no information asymmetry, do you think that market would have some form of stabilization in a way? Because if you're looking at the argument saying that it is the information asymmetry of central banks that make them perform their role, do you think that market would have some form of stability in a way? Thank you.
Thank you, Oladapo. Pasquale, are you still with us?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yes, stop sharing. Yes, no, thank you very much, Oladapo, for your comments. Yes, I think Goodhart is correct in emphasizing these non-competitive aspects of central banking. And indeed, even in the seminar, I think I mentioned that one of the reasons for the effectiveness of central bank is their monopolistic power to issue fiat money. So the fact that they have this monopolistic power is also an essential element for their effectiveness. But the completely decentralized banking model, I have some doubts about the effectiveness and the stabilizing effects of a completely decentralized banking model, because I think no, the old discussion between Keynesian and monetarists, I think is quite useful under this respect. The implicit assumption behind the decentralized banking model is that a decentralized market economy is stable, the price system works, and any imbalances are short-lived and they will be corrected effectively by the price system. An alternative view is that no, we are in a second best world. There are missing markets, and there are externalities, inefficiencies in a decentralized market economy. And sometimes it's useful to have a centralized institutions to internalize some of these externalities, and this is what central banks do. So my personal view is that it is useful on balance to have centralized institutions that seek to internalize some of these externalities and possibly correct some market failures. The experience of the cryptocurrencies, well, I'm not a great fan of cryptocurrencies, and certainly what has been happening just in the past few days is quite symptomatic with the collapse of the cryptocurrency exchange and that completely decentralized, unregulated market exposes investors to risks. And one of the aims of regulations is also to protect investors from even just from fraud or from abuses or and cryptocurrency is completely unregulated, and there is no protection for investors. And no, in my view, there are big doubts as whether cryptocurrencies could actually ever be a proper monetary instruments. If we go back to John Hicks and his roles of money as a means of payment, store of value and unit of account. Currency should be relatively stable, otherwise it cannot be used as a store of value. And cryptocurrencies are anything but stable in their value. And we've seen huge gyrations in the values in recent years. So even if we go back to standard classical textbook definition of money as described by John Hicks, cryptocurrencies do not fulfill those conditions. But that's my own personal view, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oladapo, and the response by you, Pasquale, and the insights. So we have one final comment from Shula Mulenga Skaona, who is a senior official of the Central Bank of Zambia, but also our own scholar here at SOAS. So Shula, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Murinde, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I'm unable to play the video. My internet connectivity is quite unstable. But in any case, I beg your indulgence. Yes, so my question is around the discussion of the relationship between the monetary aggregates and spending patterns. Increasingly, I think we have seen empirical papers where they dispute that the relationship between monetary aggregates and expenditure patterns has collapsed over time. And this has been attributed mostly to economic developments and new developments such as payment systems technologies. So I was just wondering, since the paper is anchored mostly on monetary aggregates, what is your view in terms of the role of fiat money versus that of payment systems? I don't know what how that would sort of be incorporated into the paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shula, and yes, Pasquale, the last comment before we close. Yeah, briefly.
Yes, I mean that's a very difficult question, and I'm tempted to cite Charles Goodhart again. Charles Goodhart has been cited before by Oladapo in the context of non-competitive features of the banking system, but we also have Goodhart's law, which says that whenever a policy relationship appears to be stable and the policy authorities try to exploit it, that relationship breaks down. And presumably this is also what happened between monetary aggregates and expenditure patterns, that attempts by the monetary authorities to exploit particular relationship which appear to be stable would lead to the relationship itself not to be reliable anymore. And certainly developments in the new payment systems technology pose a huge challenge to conventional fiat money issued by central banks. So I think, yes, it's a challenge for the central banks. I understand that many central banks are trying to anticipate the developments and develop digital currencies and make sure again that consumers have the advantage of more advanced technology for transactions, but they still have some protection in ways that completely decentralized, unregulated payments technologies do not have. So I still believe there is a role for central banks, even with these new financial technologies, in trying to develop instruments that are somehow regulated and afford customers some degree of protection.
Thank you indeed, Pasquale. We are running out of time, and I'm not sure if there is a pressing comment, pressing question. None to my attention. I go into the chat. Okay. Okay. So once again, I'd like to express our sincere thanks to Pasquale and Cesare for a very interesting paper that leads insight into monetary policy. The start of a very interesting discussion in view of contemporary challenges. I also would like to thank all of you participants who have contributed questions, comments, observations, and different interpretations of the paper. This is what the Center for Global Finance such seminars are for exchanging these views and for informing ourselves. And I want you to join me, and we give a hand of applause to Pasquale and Cesare in the usual way, and also applause to ourselves for being able to actively participate in this meeting.